yesterday on how America looks at India-China relations, what is their perception about it and all that. Dr. Smith has been here since Sunday, and of course he must have interacted with a large number of people, so he must be tired of repeating the same thing, and he also has a meeting with MEA now, so we need to finish the interaction latest by 3:10, 10 minutes past 3. So if you have any questions to ask him after he speaks to us, please keep your questions brief and direct rather than giving comments, offering comments to him. With that, may I request Dr. Smith to please tell us what you think India-China relations are about.
Sure thing. First, let me thank IDSA for hosting me for this talk. Jagannath has been a good friend for some time. Back when I was doing research for my book on China-India relations, Jagannath was extremely helpful in providing me with his own research, with putting me in touch with other fellows here in Delhi. Nami I know for many years. My friend, Commander Singh, his old buddy at the National Maritime Foundation, Uday Bhaskar, have all been very good to me every time I've come to Delhi, and I appreciate the warm greeting this time around as well. A few objectives I have for this talk, which I'm going to keep short. I prefer not to lecture. I would prefer to keep this interactive and hear your own questions, your thoughts, and your feedback. So I'm going to maybe speak for 15 to 20 minutes, and then hopefully we can have this as an interactive discussion. I was asked to talk about U.S. views of the China-India relationship. And in some ways, I think this is a difficult topic to cover because there's, I would say, a great deal of confusion in the U.S. about China-India relations, or ambiguity or misunderstanding. I think for a lot of U.S. politicians, this is a difficult relationship to unpack, and it's a relationship that is heavy with sort of history and emotion and complex technical issues. I mean, I think it's pretty rare to find a politician in the U.S. who knows the difference between Tawang and Tripura, or understands the settled populations language and the political parameters agreement of 2005. When I try and explain this to them, their eyes tend to glaze over. But I think that there is a simple construct which works for America when trying to think about China-India relations, and I think if you reduce it to its most basic level, it's not so different from U.S.-China relations, which is that there's growing cooperation at the economic and diplomatic levels, growing integration, and yet at the same time, growing mistrust in the strategic arena. So there's two parallel tracks that are moving forward, even though they're going in opposite directions. They're not precluding each other. That's something that Americans can understand. I think it's not good news to proponents of the economic interdependence theory, those people who think that the more and more that two countries engage economically, the more it will ease their political tensions and the more that it will reduce the prospect for rivalry. I think there's quite a bit of evidence in this century to suggest that that's not been the case. But I think that is a good formulation for thinking about it. And I think people in the U.S. do understand the basic drivers of the competition between China and India. I think they understand that there's a border dispute, even though they probably don't understand how complex it is. I think they understand that there's disagreements over Tibet and India's hosting of the Dalai Lama, over Chinese support to Pakistan. I think there's understanding that, you know, when Chinese nuclear subs surface in the Indian Ocean, that probably makes India uncomfortable, and when Indian oil companies are searching for energy off the coast of Vietnam in waters claimed by China, that maybe makes China uncomfortable. But I don't know, I think what they get stuck on is, well, what does this mean for the U.S.? What does it mean that there's this competition between India and China for the United States? They have seen a tremendous growth in U.S.-India relations over the past decade, past 15 years. I know sometimes we in Washington get dinged for being too short-term in our thinking, and I wish my American colleagues would show a little bit more patience and understanding at times. But even even most there recognize how far our two countries have come. And some of the statistics most of you already know, but we already conduct more exercises with one another than any other countries in the world. Something you may not know, the largest country-specific caucus in the U.S. House of Representatives is the India Caucus. You know, just thinking of how far we've come on nuclear issues, on America's presence in the region. I mean, it wasn't that long ago that India preferred to have American military gone from the region. I think they wanted us out of Diego Garcia if they could have had it that way. Now, American troops are welcome on Indian soil. You know, the military exercises that I spoke of, I think India would prefer that American troops stay in Afghanistan longer. I mean, we've gone from the U.S. spearheading international nuclear sanctions on India to leading a major effort to reshape the entire international nuclear regulatory framework to welcome India in. So I think in any way you look at it, if you sort of step back and look at it from a historical, strategic, long-term perspective, the growth has been remarkable. So they see this growth in U.S.-India relations, and they see these points of competition in China-India relations, and I think many there wonder why this hasn't brought the U.S. and India closer together on China-specific issues. I think they see a wariness from India not to want to move too close to the U.S. for fear of offending China, and what they see as maybe some waffling or strategic uncertainty on India's part. I think when Mr. Modi came to power, maybe they thought that this was an opportunity to get some more clarity, that maybe he would offer a firmer stance either one way or another, either would more decisively move toward the U.S. or show a decisive stance toward China one way or another. And if you ask most American officials or scholars 1 year later, I think they'd tell you that we haven't been given any answers, that there's still a lot of uncertainty on where India stands and where Mr. Modi stands, and that it's really been mostly mixed signals, both good and bad. And I agree with that, but I don't know that that is providing more ambiguity. I think you can have mixed signals, but actually also greater clarity. And if I had to interpret it, I would say that Mr. Modi is just approaching it with more confidence. That is, he is more confident to seek cooperation, economic cooperation and investment with China than his predecessors were. Maybe there was a time when it was seen as a strategic concern or threat to seek investments or speak highly of economic cooperation with China. I think he's been more confident in doing so. When he sees it's in India's national interest, he will welcome cooperation with China. On the other hand, he's also been more confident in speaking firmly to China. He made some rather firm comments about the border dispute on the campaign trail in Arunachal Pradesh. He did so from Tokyo while he was visiting there, which has its own strategic significance. And he even very publicly raised the border issue while he was in Beijing most recently, which again there's a firm signal there. So I think if there is a takeaway or an impression that the Americans have or should have, it's that he will be more confident in both, and that when the Chinese are willing to play ball and pursue mutually beneficial economic policies, that he will willingly embrace it without reservation, and when the Chinese conduct sort of provocative acts or there needs to be pushback, he won't be afraid or reserved about doing so. My impression of China's sort of interpretation or approach to Mr. Modi is that they have continued to talk a relatively good game on diplomatic comedy, but there's a number of opportunities they've had to even sort of reach out for low-hanging fruit and send a signal to India or to Mr. Modi that they were willing to enter a new chapter or put some of these past grievances behind them. And I haven't seen them take the opportunity to do so. I understand they have not been particularly forthright in trying to seek India's inclusion in the maritime Silk Route. Publicly, they want Indian inclusion, but I think behind the scenes they haven't done a lot to try and curry favor with Delhi or include Delhi in the planning for this. Even more minor moves like supporting Indian membership at the UN Security Council. I think all 4 of the 5 members have already done so, have already said that the Security Council should be reformed and India should be included. I don't actually think it would be a huge stretch for China to also endorse it. The actual practical complications to achieving Security Council reform are actually rather large. Sure, coffee. So I think that's almost something that you could do without harming your own interests, but to send a signal to Delhi that we're trying to turn a new page. I don't see any movement on the border issue at all. I don't see any interest in exchanging maps, something that Delhi has been pushing for some time now to clarify each positions on the line of actual control. I don't see any forward progress on Pakistan. In fact, they've moved at the United Nations to block sanctions on known terrorists based in Pakistan. So I think from the Indian side, from Mr. Modi's side, I think we get more confidence, both in pursuing beneficial cooperation, but also in being firm when necessary. And from China, I think we've seen a bit more of the same, which is talk a good diplomatic game, but sort of less commitment to walking the walk than talking the talk. I've just sort of outlined, and I'll conclude with this, a few areas that I think Americans will be watching to see how the China-India relationship will evolve under Mr. Modi. And they're sort of key areas or key indicators moving forward. I think this New Silk Road initiative being pursued by the Chinese, One Belt, One Road, New Silk Road initiative, they're expending, this is a very big project for them, something they're expending a lot of capital on, something that it's very important for them to get inclusion from countries in continental Asia. India has sort of not been reserved about approaching this with caution, and I think it was noteworthy that in Mr. Modi's visit to Beijing there was no mention of the New Silk Road in the joint statement. I think there's questions about exactly if India is going to sit out or stay away. What does that mean? Is Delhi going to propose an alternative to the New Silk Road initiative? Is it going to actively oppose it? Will it just look for some more time to understand exactly what this initiative is about? Because frankly, Beijing has not provided a lot of clarity or details about this. Will it try and join at a later date, which would probably put it in a weaker position? But how will India approach this New Silk Road initiative in general, I think, is an important question. India's engagement in the Western Pacific. I think people in the U.S. are glad that Delhi has become a vocal proponent of freedom of navigation. And this is becoming even more and more salient of an issue now that China is engaged in relatively unprecedented land reclamation projects in the South China Sea. So how will India respond to this? Will it continue conducting joint military exercises with the U.S. and Japan in the Western Pacific that make China uncomfortable on occasion? Will ONGC continue exploring for energy off the coast of Vietnam in waters claimed by China, which has been a point of contention? Will they renew contracts? Will they pursue new exploration contracts? The Andaman and Nicobar Islands. Will India finally move to bolster the military forces there, or the strategic capabilities there, the conventional forces there? This is something that I think has been talked about for a while here, but the actual movement there has been very, very slow. And in some ways, you could see that as a barometer that I think if India were growing extremely uncomfortable with China's growing naval presence in the Indian Ocean, I think moving to bolster the capabilities of the Andaman and Nicobar Islands would be a pretty clear signal that this was being taken seriously. Clearly, we'll be watching the border dispute. Is there diplomatic movement on that? Is there any interest from the Chinese in exchanging maps to clarify the perceptions of the line of control? Will special representative talks, which are now in their 18th iteration, which actually, it's actually now approaching the 50 or 51st iteration of talks. The SR talks were a relatively newer component of what's now been 5 or 6 separate series of talks. So will we see movement there, or will we continue sort of nominal agreements on military hotlines and agreeing to pursue cooperation and confidence building at the LAC, as we have, which frankly has been effective in preventing conflict at the LAC, but actual movement on the border has been scant. I think there's a few others, but we can go into those in greater detail in Q&A. I'd like to hear from you all either how you see the development of China-India relations under Mr. Modi, or how you see America's role in this relationship, or if you just have questions about U.S. policy in Washington. I'm a relatively open book and will give you a straighter answer than most American visitors, so use the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Thank you. It's very concise and very succinct expression of views as you see things from and I don't think there is much disagreement on what you said. I think these views are rather close to what everybody thinks. That's the state of relationship presently. And of course, how things move, difficult to predict at the moment. But let me ask my friends, colleagues here, other than Nami and Dr. Panda, who have already been picking your brain from time to time. So let me request others for questions. Yes, please. Yes.
Thank you, sir. 2 questions. The first one is that how US, what is the ideal situation for the United States for India-China relationship? How US would like to see India-China relationship? In what shape you would like to see it? This is my first question. And second question is that if India joins China's Silk Route Initiative, whether it will be, what do you think, if India joins in the China's Silk Route Initiative, whether it will be good for the region, good for the world? And also, if I may ask another question, that do you think that this One Belt, One Road initiative of the of China, which Silk Route also is a part of it, so it is also a counter to US rebalancing strategy?
Can we take a couple of questions together, if you don't mind? Or would you like to answer one by one?
I think we just did. What would the U.S. like to see from China-India relations? Frankly, what the U.S. would like to see is a harmonious China-India relationship, but I think we would like to see a harmonious China more than anything. We would like to see a peaceful rise from China. We would like to see China play by the rules of the road and accept the international system and work within the international system and be a responsible player. And I frankly do think there's many in Beijing who share that goal and who would like to see that pursued. Unfortunately, I also think there's others who do not and who have a different conception about China's role in the region and its trajectory. And I think that they believe that China endured a century of humiliation and that the U.S. military is actively trying to contain it, and that China's neighbors nibbled away at its territory while China was weak, and now they have a prerogative to retake that territory. So in the current geopolitical context, what I think Washington would like to see is a group of countries, friendly, mostly democratic countries of like-minded thinking in the Asia-Pacific, working together collaboratively, not in an offensive manner to contain China's rise, but working together collaboratively in an insurance policy to ensure that when these boundaries are tested and these status quos are moved, that we are on the same page and we can speak with one voice. So I think the U.S. wants to see continued good development of China-India relations, but I think the U.S. also wants to see continued U.S.-India dialogue on China, if that's a fair answer. Will China's Silk Road be good for the region and the world? So I'm of sort of 2 mindsets on this. I think practically speaking, China, which has the expertise and the capital to build a tremendous amount of affordable infrastructure on continental Asia, I think that's a good thing. I think first of all, the continent, underdeveloped parts of the continent desperately need infrastructure. And I think whether that's their goal or not, they could end up improving the living standards of tens, maybe hundreds of millions of people if they play this right. And I think objectively that's a very good thing. The question is, this doesn't happen in a zero-sum equation or in a vacuum. And if ultimately China's grand strategy has more sort of neo-imperial ends in mind, the concern is that by strengthening their position throughout Asia, by mitigating their dependence on sea lines of communication for trade, by currying favor in new capitals, by having more and more governments in debt to China, by building influence in all these countries and investing in all these countries, if that grand strategy turns more hawkish and aggressive, then that puts China in a much stronger position. There are also, of course, questions about, with Chinese investments, what does that come with political strings attached? Does that come with expectations about how you'll behave toward China on certain international issues? Does that mean you can't host the Dalai Lama anymore? Does that mean you can't have relations with Taiwan? Does that mean if China has an infrastructure project in your country that you have to import Chinese labor, or can you use your own? So I think there's the potential for great benefit there, but the devil is sort of in the details. I don't think it has an impact on the U.S. pivot to Asia, though.
You partially answered my question.
Oh.
I'll ask a more specific question. What role does United States envisage for India in the Asia-Pacific region?
What role does the U.S.
envisage for India in the Asia-Pacific region? What role?
Yes. Well, I was glad to hear the Obama administration, who I think has not, frankly, devoted enough attention to India. I'm an India watcher, so I'm sure, if you're focused on missile defense, you think the administration hasn't done enough on missile defense. If you're focused on Africa, you think the same. I frankly would like to have seen more attention, and I would like to see more attention paid. But I will say that sort of at the very top, the way that they have spoken about India is as a linchpin of security in the Indo-Pacific, encouraging India not just to look east, but to act east. I think they've actually been very direct and straightforward in professing the idea that we see India as a net provider, and in fact I think we've used these words, a net provider of security in the Indian Ocean. That we are very supportive of India's efforts to build its own strategic capabilities, because we don't see India as a threatening country. We don't see any offensive intent there, and we see it as a very helpful partner in securing the global commons, in freedom of navigation in the Indian Ocean, in anti-piracy, in humanitarian and disaster relief. So I think the U.S. has been relatively active and vocal in promoting a larger role for India, not only in the Indian Ocean, but in the Western Pacific.
Abhijit?
Yeah, we've spoken about this earlier, but I just wanted to know once again, just also the benefit of the audience, what are your views on China's maritime Silk Road? Do you see it as a string of pearls reloaded? I mean, just a benign term to describe a dangerous strategy.
Yeah.
And second, what does the U.S. make of Chinese submarine incursions into the Indian Ocean region, these forays that have been happening over the past 1 year? Do you sort of link them up with a Chinese strategy for greater assertion in the Asia Pacific, especially in light of what's happening now in the South China Sea, the reclamation activities, and at least the fact that they want to push back on the US pivot, and they might be trying to open out a new theater of operations in the Indian Ocean region? And lastly, have you also looked at, or do you have some views on the new white paper that now talks of offshore defense It just doesn't speak of a coastal strategy, but also open seas defense.
Right.
And does that mean that they could have a bigger role to play in the Indian Ocean? Because that's of direct concern to the Indians. Thanks.
Well, it's a great question, and in some ways you answered it with this strategy paper being released. But let me take a step back to answer that. So the string of pearls debate, which I'm assuming is a term many of you are familiar with, it's been around since 2005. A U.S. consulting firm, Booz Allen Hamilton, was commissioned to do a study on Chinese activities in the Indian Ocean, and they actually coined this term, the string of pearls, because they saw a number of Chinese investments in Indian Ocean rim countries, in ports and harbors and listening posts, and they titled it the String of Pearls, with a sort of nefarious undertone about China's designs on the Indian Ocean. I think in the years after that, maybe in the past 10 years, from 2005 to 2015, at first there was a lot of alarm about this. I think here, maybe mostly here in Delhi, but also in Washington. And then you had sort of this curve where the more and more people looked into it, the more and more they saw that actually the terms of these investments were almost exclusively economic in nature, that there were no explicit military bases, there was no agreements for basing rights, that these actually seemed like, on the surface, legitimate economic investments. Maybe we were jumping the gun a little bit too much. Maybe China was simply investing money in a lucrative new port facility and trying to curry some political influence in the process. I think now we're starting to come back full circle and recognize that, well, actually maybe China's designs on the Indian Ocean do have a much more military component. In my book, I sort of mention this. I don't think that the people concerned about the string of pearls were wrong. I just think they were a decade or two early. It was easy for China to say, we have no interest in military bases abroad, no designs to send our Navy into the Indian Ocean or elsewhere, when they didn't have the capability to do so. It was very easy to make a philosophical argument about why we are sort of committed on every level not to do this. Well, now they do have the capability to do so. They've seen very rapid improvements in their naval capabilities. And let's add that there are legitimate reasons and interests why the Chinese Navy might want to be operating in the Indian Ocean. I mean, a vast majority of the country's imports are oil and gas imports come from the Middle East and must cross thousands of miles of open sea, through the Strait of Malacca, a narrow naval choke point, through lanes that are patrolled by the U.S. Navy. They're vulnerable in wartime. If I were China, would I be confident to say, you know what, that's fine, I'm okay with the U.S. Navy and the Indian Navy controlling where all my sea lanes go through? Maybe not. So it's not so surprising to me now that in China's new white paper, in publications by the PLA Navy, you're starting to see them sort of spread their wings a little bit and say, okay, well, maybe we were really, really opposed to military bases abroad before, but that's changing now, and we have interests farther abroad. We need to evacuate Chinese citizens when there's a conflict in Libya or Syria. We have to protect our ships from piracy off the Horn of Africa, and we want to protect our sea lanes. And they're basically laying the foundation to begin a much more active strategy in the Indian Ocean. I do see that. And I think their willingness to assume control of Gwadar Port also is a signal. You know, for a while there, Gwadar was considered the string of, the crown pearl. This is a very large port in Pakistan, of the string of pearls, but China never actually operated the Gwadar port. It was operated by a Middle Eastern company, I think Dubai Port Holdings, if I'm not mistaken. Singapore, that's right. And frankly, I remember statements from Pakistani officials saying China will now be taking control of Gwadar. This was prematurely years ago, and the Chinese coming out and saying, no, we won't. I'm not sure what information you're getting, but we've reached no such agreement. They now have assumed control of Gwadar. And this rather large $46 billion China-Pakistan economic corridor, which was announced very recently during President Xi's visit to Pakistan, is a sort of doubling down on Pakistan from our perspective. So I do think that they are preparing the ground for a bigger presence in the Indian Ocean. Absolutely. I think the presence of nuclear subs and more conventional subs in the Indian Ocean is a clear indication of that. And I frankly expect to see more of that. The U.S. and India actually, frankly, do a lot of intelligence sharing on this matter. And I remember some of the tidbits uncovering research for that book showed the number of subsurface contacts with unidentified countries that were, it was no secret, China was the one being referenced, but if you look at the number of contacts made with Chinese subs in the Indian Ocean or around near the Strait of Malacca, they've been increasing exponentially. And again, some of this is natural from China's perspective, but it's also something that needs to be taken into account here and in Washington.
Thank you. I just wanted a clarification. I think at the beginning of your talk, you said, when Prime Minister Modi came into power, there was an expectation in Washington that, India perhaps will make a decisive shift towards the US or towards China. I mean, maybe I've misunderstood this. But in the larger scheme of things, considering, New Delhi has been harping upon multi-alignment and in terms of securing India's national interest, how realistic are those expectations? Can Washington actually expect India to be, binary in terms of its choices?
That's a fair question. No, I don't think it can, and if it does expect that, it will be disappointed. But I do think greater clarity. I do think there was real mixed and ambivalence for some time that India was giving to the U.S., to China, and to the world. And I don't think it's unreasonable to ask for some greater clarity. And I think in some ways he has given that. I mean, the fact that he talked about the U.S. as a natural ally on the campaign trail. I mean, the word ally was, for a long time, a non-starter here. I mean, the fact that you would refer to the world superpower, I mean, a country who's, for a long time, sort of anti-imperialism was a very important driving force here. To talk about the hyperpower, the superpower as a natural ally is a big deal. I mean, I think the willingness to go that far does provide some greater clarity. But you're right in that there are probably most in Washington who want very clear, very firm decisions. Where do you stand? Are you with us? Are you against us? And I mean, it's nonsensical. It doesn't work in this world full of shades of gray. And we try and tell them that and get them to calm down as much as we can. But I don't blame them for at least wanting it. Maybe we won't get it. But to want a better idea of how India sees the evolving geopolitical equation, how it sees its relationship with America, and how it approaches China. I mean, I understand there's uncertainty there. I understand that there are people here who are uncertain about where America stands. I know when there was talk about G2 back in the beginning of Obama's presidency, is the U.S. going to sort of abandon its friends and allies at some point and tie up with China and try and manage the global affairs with these two? I mean, can we have confidence and certainty in where America stands if there's a dispute at the border and there's a Chinese incursion? Where does America stand on the matter? It's a fair question. So I don't think it's sort of invalid for us both to be constantly seeking greater clarity and understanding of each other's positions.
Dr. Smith, you see, could you please clarify? I had observed a degree of ambiguity, or I would say explicitness has not been there in U.S. policy vis-a-vis certain strategic interests related to the border in the northeast and east. Like I'm saying, right from the Cold War days, Bhutan's border, in the Doklam Plateau, when Chinese had done some maneuverings and incursions. On that, the US did not come out explicitly. And now vis-a-vis the Arunachal issue, where periodically they ramp up this issue, on that also I have not observed US to be taking a stand, despite, the general approach to have a peaceful resolution of the border issues and all that.
Yeah. So actually, and a lot of people don't know what the U.S. official position is on the border dispute. This may be interesting to you all because I didn't know it before I wrote the book. The U.S. official position, and this was taken in 1962, and it remains the U.S. official position today, is that there is no border dispute in the eastern sector, that Arunachal Pradesh is Indian territory, and that is the international border with China, period. In Aksai Chin, the U.S. position is that this is a disputed territory that is up to China and India to resolve peacefully through negotiations. In some ways, that's a favorable position, I would think, from India's perspective. On the territory you control, the United States recognizes completely as Indian territory. On the territory China controls, the U.S. does not recognize that as Chinese territory. It recognizes it as disputed. It should be reflected on the map. Yes, on U.S. maps, there is an international borderline on Arunachal, and there's a dotted line around Aksai Chin.
This was also vindicated by Nick Burns.
Yes.
He also reiterated that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So where the U.S. stands formally on the territorial question is actually rather clear. Where I think people here, and I think where your question is pointing to, is what is the U.S. position when we have incursions and activities? And if the U.S. is a friend of India's, why doesn't it speak out more vocally when we see that there's a Chinese activity? And that's frankly a question for the U.S. government. They have decided to remain quiet on that and suggest that whenever there is a flare-up, that it's up to the two sides to resolve this peacefully. And frankly, that may stem in part from a lack of understanding and knowledge about what is going on at the LAC. I mean, sometimes when there's a border dust-up, I mean, these are patrols that are in areas where neither side has defined the line of actual control. When we hear about something that's happened in an Indian news report, we don't know if it was an Indian patrol that went a little too far, or a Chinese patrol that went a little too far, or who shouted first, or what's going on. So, were China to come across the border with divisions and were there, actual exchanges of fire, I think you'd see a much more robust U.S. response and position on the matter. But so long as it's these sort of patrols tailing each other and he said, she said, and this one erected a listening post on top of that mountain, I mean, I think to them it's just safer to say hands off and we just hope you resolve, the latest dust up peacefully.
Thank you, sir. During your presentation, you said that India-China relation is quite similar to that of US-China relation. So it says most things and also clarifies most of the things. As you know, broadly, economically they engage each other, and politically, military, they have much differences. But my question is quite different. Is there any thinking in Washington working together these three countries, US, China and India, on global issues, or resolving the problems that they confront, many of the global challenges like climate change, terrorism, or even developmental issues? If these three big countries, if they work together, most of the world problem, may resolve, and this will bring more peace and stability, that is critical to the, all these three countries. So is there any thinking in Washington about working, on these global issues, developmental and also security challenges?
It's a good question. I'm not privy to what sort of the State Department is thinking right now on this. I do know that a few years back there was a push to start a high-level U.S., India, China trilateral dialogue. And the resistance, from my understanding, actually came from the Chinese side, who said, you and I, the United States and China, should be sitting down at the table negotiating these type of things. We are in the same class. India should not necessarily have a seat at that table with us. Not that they're opposed to multilateral cooperation, not that they're opposed to dialogue with India, but I do in some ways think that the Chinese either see themselves or want to see themselves on a separate plane with the United States, and they see India more as on one tier down with other Asian middle powers. And to elevate India to that level, I think in their mind would have unnecessarily promoted India into this club of global superpowers and put those two on the same level, which symbolically was unpalatable to them. But again, that's my unsophisticated understanding of an attempt that was made a few years back. My understanding is that Beijing's opposition at the time kind of put that idea to rest. Whether it's been revived in the interim or whether there's plans to try and pursue something like that again in the near term, I'm not sure. But it's something certainly worth watching.
A small one. With regard to AIIB, I saw your latest piece you wrote about China. Just wanted to know what's the current thinking in US about AIIB? Are you really planning to join at some point of time? How is it coming up?
Yeah, I'm not sure whether we're planning to join. I think that decision has not been made yet, and if it is, it's not public. I think it was a real diplomatic embarrassment to the administration. When the AIIB was announced in, I believe it was late 2013, the thought was this was not going to be a particularly big or effective initiative, and the U.S. publicly leaned on its allies to stay out. But we don't think this is a good idea. We think it undermines the IMF and the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank, and we don't think your cooperation or inclusion would be wise. I think for a while that seemed like it would probably happen, and then in the last 6 months there was a rush to join the AIIB when it became clear that this was going to be a real institution with real capital. They won a few capitals over to become founding members, and then there was a real rush to join. And I think that caught the Obama administration by surprise, and frankly was left looking rather impotent on the matter when we publicly said to our friends, don't join this new Chinese initiative, and they went and did it anyway. I actually think that there's a fairly good case to make for the U.S. joining, which is that, voting shares are allocated, governance will be allocated by the size of your contribution in your economy. So if countries like the US and Japan join, China's own voting share goes down, and then the US and Japan and others actually have a chance to influence the operations from the inside. I know that there was certainly some question in the beginning about how the bank would operate. Would this be essentially a tool of Chinese foreign policy? Would Beijing be sort of dictating who the bank lended to on what terms? I know initially some Chinese experts or scholars or officials said that they didn't want to do the same type of model of governance that the IMF and World Bank do, which is day-to-day governance by a supervisory board, that they thought that that wasn't necessary here. And that kind of signaled, well, maybe there won't be the type of regulations and standards and rules in place that we would like to see. They've actually released now, I think just in the past few days, more details on how it will be governed. I haven't had a chance to look them over yet, but I think ultimately that will probably help color the decision on whether or not the U.S. should join. But as far as I know, unless something has happened very recently, there's been no decision made yet.
Yeah, please.
Thanks, Jeff. That was very fascinating. So, listening to you and also listening to other scholars or looking at China's rise, I think the key question is Is China really now going towards the phase where it wants to question U.S. presence, like seriously? Because now you're saying that they're very serious about the bases, they're serious about improving their influence in the Indian Ocean, even the assertiveness with regard to reclamation of land. I can see, because I was recently in New Zealand, and I could see that Vietnam and Philippines is very unhappy that the U.S. is not coming out more in favor of their own claims vis-a-vis China. So the larger question is it true that the U.S. is now willing to share power with China, given the fact that it's not able to rebalance as it wanted to?
I don't see any sense that the U.S. is sort of resigned to accept any outcome in the Western Pacific that it doesn't want, in the sense that I don't see any notion that we feel like we're losing that battle and that we need to make concessions to China. In fact, I think it's quite the opposite, because if you look at the state of play in the region 6-7 years ago, if you want to go back to 2003 or 2004, most countries, I'd say around the world, but certainly in Asia, I think we're wary of American influence. This is the overbearing superpower that is invading countries that it shouldn't be. We're tired of the American cowboy riding around doing whatever it wants and guns blazing without, shooting first and asking questions later. The Philippines evicted us from a military base that we were in for a long time. Look at the situation, and China was on a soft power offensive at the time. And you look at the situation now, and people in the Pentagon say the phone doesn't stop ringing for people that want American presence back in the region, that want to do military exercises. The Philippines now wants a more permanent American presence there. And we're transferring more and more assets to the region under the sort of framework of the pivot. And Ashton Carter, the new Secretary of Defense, who's quite strong and vigorous, recently said that we would be shifting even more assets to Australia, even though they might not include long-range bombers. They may not. We're sending more there. We're actively challenging the notion that we can't fly surveillance aircraft over these reclaimed islands. So I don't see the U.S. as in a position of weakness in the Western Pacific, and I don't see us being backed into a corner or having to concede anything to China at the moment. The fact is that their power and influence is growing, but that does not mean that it's not an entirely zero-sum construct. They can both be happening at the same time. And I don't see the U.S. commitment to the region waning at all.
Thank you, Dr. Smith. I think you've been very candid in answering all the questions. There's three small observations I thought.
Sure.
One is that good that you refer to the mixed signals also coming from Washington. And they have really been mixed. Even about AIIB, I think the importance of economic interdependence is not to prick China too much, actually have emanated from America itself. You have given in to large number of issues, primarily because of the economic interdependence and so much of American Chinese investments in America. If that be so, then you can't fault France, UK, or Germany from joining in AIIB. Obviously, they see. Also, of course, is the fact that IMF and World Bank have not been the model of governance, economic governance at all. And there have been frequent exhortations from many countries, including India, to say to reform these institutions and how they function. But this resistance has come from America, that even the more voting rights, on the voting rights issue, there has been no forward movement. So, and it goes without saying that even some other crucial issues like UNCLOS and all this, America has not really been coming forward to, where it will strengthen their position, legally speaking and morally speaking. So there are mixed signals of various kinds coming from America. I know that the signals to the contrary also emanate from America. But this tendency of behaving like an onion, with each layer coming back with a different color or something like that doesn't really help. There needs to be some clarity on these issues. Second, yes, you mentioned right at the beginning that China's support to Pakistan has been an issue with India. It remains a very strong issue, actually. And we believe that despite nice words being exchanged between the leadership, China has not backed down from this position and is not likely to back down anytime soon because it serves their strategic purpose. But I'm sometimes little not too convinced by how America does. For example, in the name of fighting the terrorists, if Harpoon missiles or Sidewinders or others are being given even now, despite the Congressional Research Center saying repeatedly that it is again a hotbed of terrorism, haven for terrorists of all kinds and everything. Despite that, if America continues to do that, sometimes we think that probably on certain issues, American and Chinese policies converge to the detriment of India. So under those conditions, how do you expect India to take a clear position one way or the other?
Yes.
And the third thing is this, that China not wanting India to sit at the same table where US and China do sit. The fact of the matter is that the idea of a G2, or a condominium, actually emanated from Washington. At that time, probably China wasn't confident enough of being up to it, be an equal peer competitor where they could share the burdens equally. China has not been sharing burdens so far, at least. It's only now started sharing economic burdens of world leadership, not otherwise, not in other fields. So China wasn't up to it. But now what has happened is that America is defensive on the issue, and the Chinese are pushing for this issue. As far as we are concerned, we are absolutely clear about the challenges that we face, internally, externally. We have many years to go before we can actually really claim that we have contributed enough globally to be actually looking for a high table. And philosophically speaking, India probably has never thought in those terms, ever. In its history, India has never thought of being there and all that. We would much rather be part of a happy family and having good relations.
That's why we love you.
We would want that instead of just being there and being object of hate by some and some others. We are not into alliances. We are not into posing up and all that. We have problems with China. You mentioned them, many of them. We understand that Chinese don't seek motivation presently in resolving them. They don't find them important enough or threatening enough that they should pay more attention to it. They probably have bigger issues to handle presently. We are very clear about our trajectory that what we need to do first and then what we need to do next. We are sure that we'll be able to handle these issues over a period of time. And I would personally be happy if others don't notice that we are going so for many years to come. Thank you.
Well, should I make a quick, do I have? Yes, just and maybe we could call the, on your first point, I actually completely agree with you. But I don't know that it's necessarily mixed signals. You're right, and I think you're 100% right, that American unwillingness to accept reform at the IMF and World Bank helped precipitate the AIIB. And frankly, while I blame the Obama administration for not handling the optics of this well, that if you had, if it became clear at some point that your allies would be joining this, don't publicly oppose it because then you look poor. It is incumbent on Republicans, who are the ones who have opposed reform and who, frankly, my think tank works with more. I think they've been wrong to oppose reform of the World Bank and IMF. And it's also Republicans, in large part, who have been opposed to UNCLOS. So I don't know that it's necessarily mixed signals on these issues as much as domestic political realities that we have to grapple with. It's not that the U.S. administration doesn't want UNCLOS. I mean, I think if you look back, the last 5 or 6 secretaries of defense have all said we need to join UNCLOS. The PACOM commanders, the secretaries of state, they're all for it. There's just opposition among some corners, domestic corners to this. So while to the outside world that understandably may seem like a mixed signal, it is for us a function of domestic politics. On Pakistan, I'm unfortunately the worst person to get to try and defend U.S.-Pakistan policy because I think it's been crazy for the past 10 years, and I've argued for a much, much tougher stand. I've argued for not selling them any kind of, major weapons platforms. I've argued for much heavier restrictions on aid and punishment for what we see as double game and support for the Taliban. Unfortunately, we're in vigorous agreement on this issue. I'll tell you that, and I think and I hope that there's been somewhat of a maturation and an evolution in understanding of U.S. policy here. I remember, years ago, coming here, it was all about Pakistan. I think people here are beginning to understand that we are not cozy buddies, that many, and I would say now the vast majority of lawmakers and policymakers in the U.S. are rather disgusted with the way Pakistan has behaved, not only its conduct in the Afghan war, but its support to militants outside of Afghanistan is abhorrent. The problem that we face, and I sympathize with U.S. policymakers in some degree, is that it's a very difficult issue to deal with. And it was even more difficult when we had 100,000+ troops in Afghanistan, because really the only effective way to supply them was through overland routes through Pakistan. Now, I've hoped for some time that as the Afghan war winds down, at the very least that point of leverage begins to decline. But they will always have this toxic cocktail of nuclear weapons and Islamist militants, and there will always be people in Washington who will be too afraid of the consequences of taking too hard of a line, because they think that the implosion of Pakistan, or Pakistan completely severing ties, will end up creating even more trouble for us and for the region. Now, that's not a great foundation for a friendship or a partnership. It's a terrible foundation, but it is what drives many people in the U.S. But I think it's important to know how we see it, even though we may still provide aid and platforms that I wish we wouldn't. There are not a lot of people in Washington anymore who look too friendly upon the way Pakistan behaves. And frankly, if you look, 10 years ago, anytime Pakistan or India were mentioned in Washington, it was probably at a conference about Kashmir. I haven't seen a conference about Kashmir or anyone even say the K word in Washington in probably years. That's off the table now. If you look at the South Asia programs in most prominent U.S. think tanks, they're staffed by Indian Americans. So there has been real change, and I think people here mostly get that, but frankly don't blame those for wishing that the change was happening further. I do. I wish it was happening more quickly. On the G2, I really do think that there was a lot more made out of that than people in Washington ever intended it to be. It was not this massive sort of project that we had been planning and envisioning for a long time. I think it was an idea floated by an administration that was very new, that was still getting its legs, from a president who didn't have a tremendous amount of experience in foreign affairs. If you actually remember in the very beginning, when he was formulating his South Asia policy, he floated the idea of maybe we should put Kashmir on the table to placate Pakistan, and was immediately told by everybody who knew anything about South Asia that that's a crazy idea and it'll never get anywhere with India, and he immediately took it off the table. I think in the first couple years there was quite a bit of feeling out and getting to know the nuances of foreign policy, what would and wouldn't be offensive. I remember when the U.S. and China agreed to a sub-dialogue on South Asia back in 2009, raised a lot of questions and alarm here. I don't think the administration even understood the implications of creating a sub-dialogue on South Asia with China, and that's been sort of brushed under the table now. So I think that was part of the growing pains of the administration more than anything. I guess we can leave it at that.
Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, I think you must appreciate that Dr. Smith has been very, very candid in his observations and has answered all the questions. And let's give him a big